Welcome back to the Snipe Museum of Art. My name is Joe Becker and I'm honored to serve as your museum director. Today we're downstairs in the Ashbaugh Education Center, one of the most dynamic, creative, and exciting places in the entire museum. It's quiet right now except for me, but usually we have dozens of children, college students, even adults here on a regular basis creating, expressing themselves, allowing their interior ideas to come out. This is a place of freedom. And it's a place of great invention. Of course, some of the usual suspects are here: crayons, scissors, markers, but also sandpaper, corkboard, tissue paper, lots and lots of found objects. Because what we value today about expression, what we value today about freedom of creativity is very important to the life of the museum and to the life of our culture. What children are able to experience and to create today is very different than a generation ago, when I was at the table, or when my parents were at the table. And certainly nothing existed that we would think about in terms of art education and appreciate as creativity a century ago when my grandparents would have been at the table. This is a great place for us to start to think about one of the most creative minds, one of the most important masters of the 20th century. Let's go upstairs to the gallery and take a look at one of his great masterpieces. We're upstairs in our gallery that houses our collection of modern and contemporary art. And behind me is an amazing piece by the Spanish artist Joan Miró. Miró was Spanish, specifically he was from Barcelona, and he was one of the most important and creative geniuses of the 20th century. His concern for the freedom of creativity, his willingness to be experimental, and the opportunities that he took to express in ceramics, in sculpture, in painting, and printmaking, new vocabularies opened up for a whole variety of artists, including students and children. Signs and Configurations dates to 1936, and it comes from a very important period in the artist's career. Let me take a step out of the way so you can appreciate the work more fully. Although Miró was classically trained as an artist, his breakthrough really came as a member of the Surrealist movement in and around Paris in the early part of the 20th century. Surrealism, as many of you know, dealt with the subconscious and dream imagery, didn't use the filters of proper society, didn't use the filters of academic training as a litmus test in terms of what could be considered creative and artistic expression. Miró was interested in the subconscious, but more importantly, he was interested in dreamlike imagery, works that had a lyrical quality to them. And although he did some non-representational imagery, the human figure remained important throughout the course of his career. In Signs and Configuration, we notice three figures. At the top center is one large face, seen primarily in profile. Just to our right is a second that has extensions which come down that look almost like the talons of bird legs. And then finally, the bottom right-hand quarter of the painting is dominated by a third figure that seems to be running from left to right and actually has two heads. There is a strong calligraphy-like quality to each of these creatures. Line and outline is very important, but it's not a straight hard line. It's a whimsical line that rises up and down and around, twists and turns and moves, and grants the overall composition great energy, gives the viewer a sense of delight. We know that line is important, especially during this period of Miró's career, for in the early and middle 1930s, he was experimenting at the reduction of color and an emphasis on black and white. That emphasis on black in particular, on a monochromatic background, flattens the images, really stresses them as two-dimensional forms. They almost appear as hieroglyphics, a kind of picture language. There are many things that can be said about the way in which the human form is depicted in Miró's work, but one basic characteristic that we should celebrate is the freedom of line, the freedom of invention, and also the freedom of materials. This image actually is made of oil paint, yes, but also sand and tar on board. In much the same way that he was willing to be experimental with form and line, he was willing to be experimental with the kind of materials that would be considered valid for a painting. As a surrealist, he was changing what we thought about as a work of art in terms of what we see, because he was expressing something freely from within him, but he was also opening up new horizons for us in terms of the kind of materials that we could use to help capture our visions, our dreams. One of the things that I have to remind myself when I see Miró's work, and especially when I see this wonderful painting that we're so fortunate to have in our permanent collection, is to be mindful of the date, 1936. This would have been a very early moment in terms of what we would think about as art education. The kind of openness, the kind of freedom, the welcoming quality that we have for all individuals to offer something from within them as a result of creative expression was not there in 1936. Our appreciation for the art of children, for example, was not necessarily there in 1936. So in many ways, Miró and his contemporaries were way ahead of their time. They were, as I mentioned earlier, opening up new horizons, not only for artists, but for audiences. I also think about 1936 and the date in terms of what was happening in world, specifically European history. As we all know, this was a moment following on waves of economic depression and rapidly building into what we think about as the Second World War. Dark clouds were forming across Spain and particularly across France and in Paris. Yet against that severity, against the heaviness of those kind of clouds, economic and warriors, there was this need to create. There was this need to invent. There was this need to express something from deep within. Freedom. Freedom of line, freedom of form, freedom of ideas, freedom of materials, freedom to think about what is a work of art. Thank you very much for spending some time at the museum today. Look forward to welcoming you back soon. And when you're here, come upstairs to the second floor and appreciate this masterpiece by Joan Miró.